welcome everyone in this room and on the live stream. Certainly, if anyone on the stream has trouble, feel free to interrupt and shout at me, but so far it seems to be running smoothly. So I will start with welcomes. So first of all, thank you. First of all, to Agilent Technologies Incorporated, which has very kindly provided financial assistance for this event for several years, and they've done it again this year. So thank you, Agilent. I'm glad you like VuFind. We like your help. And also thank you to the communications team here for doing logistics, setting up rooms, making name badges, etc. And to Unit for recording this. Thank you, Brian. I'll also point out that we are on Twitter, at least a little bit. So if you want to tweet about this, you can use the hashtag VuFind2018. So what is new with VuFind since the last summit? The answer is VuFind 5.0 and 5.0.1. And what is new in that? Probably most significantly, we've updated some of our dependencies. So we now are using Solr 7.3.1, and we're also up to date on the Zen framework components we're using. I say Zen framework 3 here, but that's kind of a hand wave because there is no single unified Zen framework anymore. It's an ecosystem of components, and for the most part, we have updated to the component versions that have 3 in their version number. But there are still some Zen Framework 2 bits that haven't been updated yet because there are no updates. On the new and improved features front, the thing I've been most excited about in VuFind development since we got an enthusiastic response to it here about 2 summits ago is the channels interface for browsing things sort of in a nonlinear way and making discoveries. We released that feature in VuFind 4, but it didn't feel quite done to me yet. And I think with VuFind 5, that has reached a fairly mature place where it looks good and it works well and it has a lot of options. So I'm hoping to see people start using that in interesting ways now that it's fully baked. Also new is the VuFind search homepages are much more configurable than they used to be, so you can control what content people see when they first come to your site in a better way than before, where there was that facet list display that was just hard-coded into everything and you could either use it or not. Now you can use it or something else. We've also added support for the Alma ILS from Ex Libris, which is a big deal because a lot of people are migrating to that system and we want them to be able to use VuFind. So they can now. It actually works. And thank you to everyone who helped with that, since that was very much a collaborative effort. Our geographic functionality has been updated to use leaflet instead of open layers, which is a bit more lightweight and also allows access to a much wider ecosystem of plugins and things that could potentially be used. So thank you, Leela, for all of the work on that. She's not here with us in person, but she's on the stream. So we may talk about some more geographic stuff later on in the road mapping. And finally, with the European data protection regulations, we've got some improved functionality for dealing with user privacy to make it easier for users to comply with those regulations. So, for example, users can now delete their own accounts if we turn on the feature to allow that. There's some better tracking of when people have last logged in. That's still something that we can always work more on, but we've made great headway with Release 5. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the things that have changed, because this was a pretty big disruptive back-end change release because of the changes in Zen Framework. When we built VuFind on Zen Framework 2, the framework was quite new, and while I still think it was a good decision and a good design, there were definitely some issues with the way the first iteration of Zen Framework 2 approached things. And with the version 3 components, they've clean some things up and straighten some things out. And in order for us to take advantage of that and get up to date, we had to reverse a lot of questionable decisions that I've made in the past. So sorry, everybody, I made some questionable decisions in the past, but celebrate because I think they've been largely fixed until we find the next set of things we want to change anyway. So if you've worked with the VuFind code in any depth, you're probably aware that the Zen Service Manager is really the core mechanism that we use for extensibility in the software. And in short, the Service Manager is just a container. So in VuFind, rather than instantiating classes in the code directly, we instead access this container and ask it to give us a named service. The point of this, well, is twofold. First of all, as I say, this drives extensibility, because if we directly create a class in our code and you want to substitute some other class there, you have to change the code. But the Service Manager provides this configurable intermediate place where you can now change the configuration of how the Service Manager returns a particular named service, and the rest of the code doesn't have to change. So that's how we do all of VuFind's extensibility one way or another. The other reason for this is that it allows you to sort of abstract away complicated initialization of objects. Because we want VuFind to be very extensible, we tend to build our code in very small parts that then fit together like puzzles. And so if we had to do all of that building in the inline code, that would be annoying and confusing and hard to change. So instead, we have the Service Manager configured to use factory classes. The factory classes do all the heavy work of building the objects and injecting their dependencies. And then from the calling code, it's a pretty seamless interaction of, hey, Service Manager, give me a service. Now I can work with the service. I don't have to worry about how it was built unless I'm actually diving in to change that particular thing. So with that review and background out of the way, what changed? Well, one of the biggest things that changed is that until version 5, VuFind services were named in a more or less arbitrary way. A few of them, the names of the services matched the names of the classes that they provided by default. In some cases, the names kind of looked like class names, but weren't really class names, because I thought that saving 5 characters of typing would be better than having something that made sense. I'm sorry. And in many other cases, there were just short descriptive names of things to make the code more readable. So that had its ups and downs. But with the new Service Manager, the convention is now every service name matches the name of the class that is provided by default for that service. So if you want a VuFind record loader, you just say Service Manager get VuFind record loader, and you get a VuFind record loader. You can, of course, still override the Service Manager so that it returns your local subclass of the record loader. That's the whole point of the Service Manager. But from the perspective of the core VuFind code, you will see class names being used to fetch services, and you can assume that those services will conform to the interfaces of those class names. This takes a lot of the guesswork out of figuring out how to get a service out of the Service Manager. And of course, those short descriptive names are still useful. The Service Manager supports an aliasing feature, so all of those short names still work. And I also have created aliases for the old stupid names that I came up with arbitrarily. So again, hopefully this will not disrupt things terribly, but I encourage you, if you have local custom code, standardize things so that service names match class names. It will be much easier to deal with in future when maintaining the code. Another small difference is that service names are now case sensitive. So the Zen Framework 2 Service Manager did all kinds of magic when you requested a service to normalize the service name so that it would strip out all of the non-word characters, it would lowercase everything. This meant that you could be really sloppy about how you requested things out of the Service Manager, and you'd still probably get things. It also meant that the Service Manager spent a lot of time normalizing text. to the point that it could actually become significantly impactful on performance, which is why the framework team decided to stop doing that. So that obviously is a significant change, because if you didn't have to worry about things like case sensitivity before, and now you do, you have to trust yourself to have done things consistently in the past, and we all know that that doesn't always happen. So what I have done, at least in the short term, is added some custom functionality to VuFind's instance of the service manager, so that it is at least less case sensitive than it would be by default to add a certain degree of backward compatibility. I'm hoping in future versions to kind of wean us away from that and get to just the core case sensitive service manager functionality, but this is a step in the right direction, and we'll keep going as we need to. So circling back to the idea of service names matching class names, one of the huge benefits of this is that it makes the factories we use to build services reusable, and potentially reduces the amount of junk you need to copy and paste when you're extending something. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that the service manager does is it can be configured to use a factory class to build a service. And that means that if we now use class names as service names, that factory can be passed the name of the service, which means that it knows the name of the class that it needs to build. This in turn means that you can use the same factory to build a whole bunch of things as long as they all conform to the same constructor interface. And so in the past, we had a lot of copied and pasted factory code that all basically did the same thing, except that a different class name was pasted into each iteration of the factory. All that can now go away. We just use a shared factory configuration, and it works. And this means that if you extend a service that uses a factory, your extended service can use that existing factory. It will just push in the name of your subclass instead of the name of the core VuFind class. The rest of the behavior will remain the same. And how does this work? Because of the core code using the VuFind default class names for fetching things, you use aliases. So if I want to extend VuFind record loader to local record loader, I configure the VuFind record loader factory to build the local record loader service, and then I create an alias saying, when you get a request for VuFind record loader, return local record loader, which maybe is confusing when you just listen to me babbling about it, but there are lots of examples. And if you use VuFind's code generators, it will do this for you. I'm skipping ahead, but yes, code generation is simpler now because you can just use our command line code generator tools to say, I want to extend this class. It will find the class you want to extend wherever it lives in VuFind's core configuration, extend it for you, create the configuration in your local module, and give you a stub class where you can fill in your logic. So again, there's a certain amount of verbose configuration in play, but hopefully you don't have to touch as much of it as you used to. And because I skipped over one of my bullets, I'll go back and say the other thing that has significantly changed in the Zen Framework Service Manager is that there have always been sort of two kinds of service managers in the framework. There's the top-level service manager, which is where you request everything from. But you can also create special purpose plugin managers that behave just like the service manager, but they exist as services. So, for example, there's a service manager, well, a plugin manager rather, for managing the ILS drivers. So when VuFind wants to connect to an integrated library system, it says, service manager, please give me the ILS driver plugin manager. Then it gets that plugin manager, and then it says, plugin manager, please give me the ILS driver that I need. So there's always been this two-tiered idea of a top-level service manager with special purpose plugin managers inside it. But where this became really confusing was that in Zen Framework 2, when you had a factory configured, it would receive as one of its parameters the plugin manager or service manager that was calling it. So if you requested a service from the top-level service manager, your factory would receive a reference to the top-level service manager. If you were creating an ILS driver through the ILS plugin manager, your factory would receive the ILS plugin manager as a parameter. And because in the service manager-based application, what your factories are largely doing is pulling services out of the plugin manager and composing them together, this could become problematic because generally speaking, all of the things that you want to pull in as dependencies are going to come out of the top-level service manager, whether you are building a top-level service or you're building a plugin. There are certain common services like the database connector or the configuration that you're always going to want to pull in. And in Zen Framework 2, what this meant was you needed to get access to the top-level service manager from the plugin manager. And there was a method called getServiceLocator, which would allow you to do this, which led to many, many factories that just said over and over again, service manager, get service locator, get service. Service manager, get service locator, get service. And this was just unintuitive and confusing and verbose. And in Zen Framework 3, they turned this on its head and said, every factory everywhere is always going to get the top-level service manager passed into it. And if you need to get a service out of your plugin manager, which is the less common case, you can always fetch your plugin manager out of the top-level service manager and get things out of it. So this means that all of our factories got much more readable because now it just shows us pulling things out of the service manager instead of getting service managers out of other service managers. And again, I'm sorry if listening to me ramble about that made absolutely no sense, but hopefully the short version is we had to make a lot of changes. All the factories and configurations are a little bit different now, but I think they make more sense than they used to. And if you have questions, please email me. So one more minor ramble about disruptive changes in the last release is that we adjusted the record driver hierarchy. Again, depending on your level of familiarity, you may or may not already have worked with record drivers a lot, but the idea of VuFind is that every record has a corresponding class that represents it in an abstract way. And each of these classes has a set of corresponding templates that can render data that the class provides. So this allows us to display a wide variety of different kinds of records within the general framework of VuFind because we can isolate the format-specific details into the record drivers and their associated templates. But again, historic, regrettable decisions. In previous versions of VuFind, there was a record driver called Solar Default, which was the default record driver loaded for any record that came out of the Solar index, which is great. And this is where most of VuFind's default behavior lived. So the default fields that could be displayed, all the default templates. The problem is that we eventually introduced other types of records that have nothing to do with Solar, like third-party services like Summon and EDS and Primo Central and WorldCat records. And because it was more convenient to share some of those Solar default templates, everything was set up so that these things were subclasses of Solar default, even though they had absolutely nothing to do with Solar. And it worked just fine, but it's nagged at me for years that this is misleading and confusing. And at the last summit, several people backed me up on that thought. So there is now a default record driver, which Solar default is a subclass of. And all those things that have nothing to do with Solar are also subclasses of default record. So hopefully the hierarchy makes a little bit more sense. There also was some shared behavior for processing MARC records to extract data from them that was built into the Solar MARC record driver, and to a lesser degree to the WorldCat record driver. All of that has been pulled out into PHP traits, which means that it can be mixed and matched into any class you like, which again makes the code a little bit more reusable and easier to understand. So following all of that work, it was pointed out to me that we had record drivers for dealing with authority records, because VuFind has a sort of bare bones authority record where you can, authority module where you can search through an index of authority records. But those record drivers assumed that all authority records were MARC, which is in fact not always the case. So the authority record driver hierarchy was redesigned to correspond with the sort of bibliographic record functionality. So you can now have different kinds of authority records in the system if you need to. Again, let me know anytime if you have questions about any of this. I am happy to help. So finally, a few more changes in VuFind 5 that were designed to bring us up to date and in line with broader community practices. First of all, we require PHP 7 now, which is great because PHP 5 is falling out of support. We don't want to encourage people to use unsupported software. Also, PHP 7 is fast. And it introduces null coalescing operator, which is the most exciting pair of question marks you have ever seen if you are a VuFind developer. Because VuFind is just full of bits of code that say, if is set, use this value, else use this default value. And just looking at pages and pages of that makes me sad. But with the null coalescing operator, you can say some value on the left, 2 question marks, some default value. And if that value on the left is set, it gets used. If it's unset, the default value is used. It's very concise. You will see it in lots of places now because I'm trying to reduce the size of the code where I can. Also, another development is that for a very long time, VuFind used short tags in its PHP template files. So just a less than and a question mark in order to run some inline PHP code. But that is not really best practice these days. Generally, PHP users are encouraged to use the full less than question mark PHP tag instead of the short version that omits the PHP. And much as I hate adding 3 bytes all over the place, I was sort of pushed over the edge into making this change by the fact that newer versions of Linux are now shipping with PHP FPM, the fast CGI process manager, as the default way of running PHP instead of running it through mod Apache. And this makes it difficult to turn on short tags in a conditional way. So in the past, we relied on short tags, but that's because we turned them on using a directive in VuFind's default Apache configuration. But that no longer works reliably across the board. And rather than making the documentation more confusing about how you actually get this thing to work, I thought we can just go with convention, do things the way that works everywhere without confusing people, and there we go. And fortunately, the PHP CS fixer tool that we use to normalize our code styles has a rule that will just automatically convert short tags to long tags. So it was no big deal to make this change, and we are secure in the knowledge that there won't be any regressions in the future because PHP CS fixer will catch them and fix them. And that leads into the point that we are now using PHP CS fixer even more than we have in the past. So all of our templates are getting style normalized, and we're using a few more rules across the board, just in the interest of, if you can make your code look consistent and follow conventions, why wouldn't you? Especially if you have a tool that just does all the work for you. So the only downside to this is that if you submit a pull request, there's a good chance that the build will fail the first time because of some tiny style issue. But then you can just run PHP CS Fixer and it will fix it for you. So I think the cost there is low. So that gets us through what has changed. So let's start to talk about what we can do next. And this is, of course, intended to get some ideas in your heads for the road mapping session this afternoon. So one thing that's definitely ongoing is continuing support for next generation ILSs, because we want people to continue to use VuFind when they migrate off of whatever antiquated platform they might be using today. So we want to be ready for that. As I already mentioned, we've got Alma covered now, which is very good. So the other big player that a lot of people are talking about is Folio, the new open source project that is currently under development. And we have been doing our best to keep abreast of developments there. There's an open pull request with a Folio driver in it that works as well as it can work, given that Folio is not finished yet. But we're trying to keep up to date with that, and that's an ongoing project. So if there are any Folio adopters or future Folio adopters out there, please touch base with us. We'd love to work with you on this, and we're certainly proceeding on our own one way or another. Other things that may be in the pipeline, and I'll briefly summarize these and then go into more detail on subsequent slides. We should keep our dependencies up to date. Much as I would love to just stop change so that we could work on features instead of updates, we can't. Things keep changing and we need to keep up with them. We need to keep working on improving what we already have architecturally as well. As I said, I really felt good about the changes that went into VuFind 5 because I thought it cleaned up some messes that had been bothering me and gives us a more clear path to how to build things in the future. But there are still some messes that I'd like to clean up, and reducing technical debt is always a good thing. Also, continuing to improve the way we measure the quality of our code so that we can find the things that need fixing and not break new things. Always important. Improving documentation. I want the community to be welcoming, and I want there to be as low a barrier to entry as possible. And I recognize that because I've been doing this so long, it is possible that I make assumptions that I shouldn't, and we need more welcoming entry points. So I'm interested in hearing about that from people who haven't been here as long as I have. And of course, I'm open to requests and suggestions. I don't feel like the version 6 roadmap has an absolute clear top priority yet. So I'm very interested to see what our conversation reveals later today. I think there are a lot of possibilities, so we just have to choose some. So to talk a little bit more about dependency updates coming down the road, one big thing that we're probably going to have to deal with in the fairly short term is the architecture for dealing with command line tools. Right now, we use the Zend model view controller infrastructure, which supports both HTTP-based and command line-based routing. But the console part of that has been deprecated and will eventually be removed so that Zend MVC can focus strictly on web transactions, which means we need to replace it with something else. It looks like the recommended something else is something called ZF console. So we will have to look into how that works and how we can incorporate it in a as backward compatible a way as possible. And I kind of look forward to this because I think right now the way the command line code is organized is less than ideal. So hopefully we can, again, clean up some messes at the same time that we're bringing things up to date and future-proofing them. And speaking of Zend MVC changing in the future, not only are they dropping console support, but there are discussions of some really major redesigns coming for Zend MVC 4. I don't know that there's a timeline on that, but again, I want to keep my eyes on the future so we don't get caught by surprise. So Zend MVC, and really all of Zend Framework 2, was built before the PHP community settled on Composer as their tool of choice for bringing in dependencies and putting things together. And so I think there's some discussion within the community about, what aspects of this tool are kind of obsolete in the age of Composer. One of the things they're talking about is the Zend module system, which used to be the way, and is the way that VuFind allows you to create a distinct module of code that overrides things from the core. It sounds like there may be a move to get rid of Zend modules entirely in favor of using something more generic. And if that happens, we'll have to come up with a mechanism to do all the things that VuFind needs from the modules without using modules, which I think is very doable, but it would be a significant change. And also, I'm, again, going out of order of my bullet points, but there's some discussion about getting rid of controller plugins, which we use in a few places, and which, again, I welcome their removal because they work in kind of a magical way where if you call an undefined function from a controller, it just causes the framework to look and see if there's a registered plugin that matches the name of the undefined function that you called. Why should we do that? It's confusing. So I'm hoping to get rid of the controller plugins and replace them with something more explicit that doesn't rely on magical behavior. And then if controller plugins do, in fact, get removed from a future release, it won't matter because we won't be using them anymore. So, design improvements. And this is more or less the same list that I put up here every year, except I've moved the order around based on my internal thoughts about priorities. So, can we refactor things to make controllers thinner? Right now, our controllers are pretty heavyweight and ugly in a lot of places, and they rely very heavily on pulling things arbitrarily out of the top-level service manager, which makes the relationships between the parts of the code potentially unclear. I would love to take some time to clean this up and make it more explicit, again, as sort of a future-proofing effort, but it's a lot of work and it doesn't do anything shiny with bells and whistles, so it hasn't been a super high priority, but I think it's something that we should approach as an ongoing task. There's also been a lot of talk about redesigning the ILS driver interface. So the VuFind project is more than 10 years old now, shockingly enough. And our ILS driver interface for connecting VuFind with library systems has grown organically over that time. So of course it has some weirdly named things, it has some inconsistencies, it has some overcomplication. And I think it would be worthwhile to revisit that and see, is there a more idealized design that we can move to just clean up some of the messiness. And I don't think that that would necessarily be a huge redesign and a huge disruption, but I think it's worth thinking about how far we can go without investing too much pain into it. There's also been talk about moving the ILS drivers to an external project so that people can utilize them for other applications than just VuFind, since there's a lot of collected knowledge about working with these systems in that code, and there could well be other applications for it. So I would sort of welcome these things going hand in hand. If we could redesign it and then publish it as a project, that would make a lot of sense. But it would also take some time, so this will depend on the willingness of people to collaborate. And that leads into, is there anything else we can split out to separate projects? There is a lot of code in VuFind, and sometimes it would be nice if it were a little bit more modular. We've pulled out some pieces here and there in the past, and I always welcome suggestions for other pieces that could be separated. Obviously, this won't change the shape of the finished project, but it will make the development aspects of it potentially a little bit more focused. Speaking of organic growth, our configuration files, another thing that has been arbitrarily growing for 10 years. They work, but do they always work exactly the way I wish they would? No. So it might be worth thinking about places there where we could invest in some backward-breaking changes that would make us happier. Again, this is not my top priority, but it's something I think about every single year. Similarly, reorganizing our language files. There's a lot of stuff dumped in there. Back in the day, we only had one file, so of course everything got dumped in there. But now we have the text domain system that allows us to sort of conceptually organize our language strings, and there may be some justification in splitting some things up more to make the internationalization a little more manageable. And finally, we have a very flexible permissioning system in VuFind that's only used in a handful of places. Perhaps there are other applications for that, something to think about, but at the very bottom of my personal priority list. So to go into more detail on code quality issues, we still don't have as much test coverage as I would like. We do have some pretty good integration tests that I think exercise most of the commonly used functionality of VuFind, which is a good place to be. But as far as unit testing of the actual low-level code in a way that reflects coverage in our continuous integration graphs, we're still only at about 20%. I'm sure we can do better than that. I would love to have more tests contributed. It's a good way to give back to the project if you want something to do that's not hugely time-consuming or complicated. And if there is interest in that, perhaps having some kind of test writing collaborative event might be doable. Also, we use PHP mess detector in continuous integration, which measures code complexity and other potential issues. And we've got hundreds and hundreds of things that it has flagged. None of these, of course, are fatal errors, but we could certainly look at some of the most complicated points in the code and start untangling those knots. Certainly this would tie in with the idea of making the controllers lighter weight, as I'm sure many of the warnings are coming from those controllers. Also, I've mentioned this before and haven't had time to follow up, but now that we have Java indexing code in the VuFind repository for our mark indexing functionality, it would be nice to be measuring that code quality and style compliance to the same degree that we currently do for our PHP and JavaScript code, just for consistency. And really the reason we're not doing that is I haven't identified tools that will do the work because I haven't had time. So, you know, Java experts out there, make suggestions, I welcome them. So on to improving documentation. As I say, I always want the barrier to entry for VuFind to be as low as possible. But when you deal with things like record driver hierarchies and service managers and plugin managers and all the stuff I rambled about earlier, it becomes apparent that the barrier to entry is not entirely low. So, as I said before, I'm interested in what beginners need to really get started. We have a wiki. I think there's documentation in there for all the things that need to be documented, but that doesn't mean that people can find what they need or that it goes into the amount of detail that they need to understand it. So I'm curious where people are looking when they want to find things out, whether they're finding what they need, if they're finding things that are up to date, or if they're finding things that have changed and need to be updated. So, you know, what can we do to improve this if indeed it needs improvement? I just assume documentation always needs improvement. So there's been talk about video tutorials. The problem with video tutorials is they're time-consuming to make, and then they go out of date in about a week, which makes me a little bit reluctant, but perhaps there are still some opportunities to do something in the video space. I certainly try to make these summit talks useful for reference, but when I stand here and talk about service managers for 15 minutes, I don't know if that's actually helpful. Feedback welcome. But anyway, I'm interested in brainstorming on that topic. Also, I wonder, is it time to get rid of the VuFind 1 documentation, because the wiki still has lots and lots of documentation that's specific to the old architecture that we have not been using for more than half the lifetime of the project. And yes, all of those pages are cross-referenced saying, this is a VuFind 1 page, you should click here to see the up-to-date documentation. I still wonder if those are catching people and confusing them. And maybe we should finally take them down and replace them with a message saying, this page is obsolete, but you can go to the revision history to see an old version if you really want to read it, or something like that. So it's a thought. We can talk about this during road mapping as well. So that gets me through all of my prepared statements. Thank you for listening to me. And I think we have about 10 minutes before the break if anyone has questions or comments they want to bring up. I'm not seeing any hands in the room. If anyone on the chat wants to say anything, just go ahead.
This is Eric from Finland. Hi. One comment about the web pages is that they don't kind of show how impressive VuFind actually is. So you can see some of the main features and some things there, but you can't easily see how much effort has been put into the software. So in addition to helping users get on when they want to start using VuFind, we could perhaps think about other ways to somehow illustrate how great the software actually is and how much you can accomplish with it. I have no idea how to actually do it, but just something that occurred to me when I was looking at the web pages.
That's a very good point, because essentially the web pages haven't changed much in content since 2007 or whenever it was they went up. The main thing that's changed is that in 2007, some of the claims they made weren't entirely true, and now I think they're all valid. But yeah, we've made good strides. We should be showing off things like the way we can mix and match content and channels, and yeah, that's worth thinking about. But it's very true in open source land, the documentation is an afterthought and the marketing is an afterthought. But we should invest some effort in that. I have a feeling that Chris is thinking about this already, just based on his expression in the audience.
Awesome. Maybe one more comment about that is that I'm not sure if we have a page for would-be contributors on how to start doing work with VuFind in a way that it would make things more accessible for beginners. Like here is an easy task for you to check out, or here are some ways that you could actually contribute to the project without understanding the full thing completely.
I think we have some scattered bits and pieces that would contribute to that, but it's certainly not in an organized way and not front and center where it probably should be. Yeah, that's another good point, and maybe something that we should add to places like the GitHub README if it's not already there. So yeah, definitely one for the to-do list, and probably sooner rather than later. Anyone else?
Demian, this is Leela. So, you know, following on what Ari was saying about highlighting good examples, well, maybe one thing on the wiki is to have a slide show of, you know, links to installations that are highlighting some of the most recent features.
Yeah, that would be good. We have the installation list, and it's never as up to date as it should be, but a real showcase would be a good marketing tool.
And you could maybe even have a flag in the showcase list, or at least just pick out the one installations that are constantly up to date, that you know that are continually staying kind of up to date with where development progress is, and showcase some of that. That just one thought maybe on how to do that.
Yeah, that's a very good idea.
It might also answer to those questions that people sometimes ask. Do you have an example of VuFind where the geographic search is used, or hierarchical facets are available, or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I mean, the idea of a slideshow kind of thing that highlights a feature, shows a screenshot of it, and links to an installation that's using it, I think that would be fairly compelling and easy to understand.
Yeah, and even if the screenshots are too much to actually maintain, having links to the features or the pages where the features are shown would be nice at least.
Right. Well, we still have 5 minutes if there are any last minute thoughts.
Well, since you asked the question, I think it might be the time to remove the version 1 documentation. I don't think anyone should be using it anymore.
I would agree. I agreed with that sentiment for about 5 years, but I think it's more realistic to talk about pulling that plug now than it used to be, especially with PHP 5 end-of-lifing and so on.
And we know that there are some issues with security things in the old version also, so discouraging it even more is a good thing, I think.
Great. So I will say, if anyone feels otherwise, speak during this summit or forever hold your peace. All right, well, I think we can probably go to break a little bit early, and we will be back in about 20 minutes to talk about the VuFind user interface, which I have completely failed to talk about because I figure Chris will do a better job. So, thank you, everyone. Back soon.